In the year 1812, something changed. Not gradually, not imperceptibly. The world transformed in ways so fundamental that they still shape everything about how you live today. Yet when you open your history textbook, when you ask someone what happened that year, the response is almost always the same. Silence, or perhaps a vague mention of a war in North America that most people can't quite remember. This absence is not accidental. It is deliberate. And understanding why this year has been erased from our collective consciousness is the key to understanding nearly everything about the modern world. Think about the years you were taught to remember. 1789, the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille, the idea that ordinary people could overthrow kings. 1945, the end of the Second World War, the atomic age, the moment when humanity gained the power to destroy itself. These years are embedded in our education, referenced constantly, understood as hinge points where history pivoted and changed direction. But ask yourself honestly, what do you actually know about 1812? Most people draw a blank, and that blank space is filled with something far more important than any individual event or battle. That blank space is filled with an entire restructuring of human civilization. A restructuring so vast, so encompassing, that those who benefit from it most have worked tirelessly to keep the truth hidden. Your textbooks tell you a story about 1812, but it is only one part of a much larger story. They focus on a single military conflict, the war between the United States and Britain. There are chapters about naval battles, about the burning of Washington, about which side technically won when neither side really defeated the other. Students learn names like James Madison and Lord Nelson. They memorize dates of skirmishes, and then they move on, believing they understand 1812. But this is the comfortable lie that institutions have been telling us for centuries. It is true enough to sound authentic, yet false enough that we remain blind to what was actually happening. While textbooks narrate military movements in North America, they maintain a profound silence about what was unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic. In Europe, empires were collapsing. Entire systems of power were crumbling. A force so powerful that it had conquered nearly the entire continent was about to destroy itself through a single catastrophic decision. Simultaneously, across the globe, populations were starving. Agricultural systems that had sustained humanity for millennia were failing. And from the chaos of war, famine, and political upheaval, something entirely new was being born. Something that would reshape how humans organized themselves, how they worked, how they related to one another, and how they imagined their futures. The silence surrounding these events is not innocent. Throughout history, those who hold power have understood a fundamental truth. Controlling the past means controlling the future. If people believe that the world we live in is natural, inevitable, the only possible outcome of progress and human development, then they will never imagine that it could be organized differently. But if people understand that our world was deliberately constructed through specific choices at specific moments, with specific consequences for specific groups of people, then the possibility of reconstruction emerges. And that possibility is dangerous to those who benefit from current arrangements. This is why 1812 disappeared from our history books. This is why you were never taught about the full scope of what happened that year. Those who wrote the textbooks, those who designed the educational systems, those who controlled which narratives would be preserved and celebrated, they had every reason to keep you in the dark. Because once you understand what 1812 actually was, once you grasp the full extent of its consequences, you will never see the modern world in the same way again. But to understand what was hidden from us, we need to first understand what was happening on the surface. And that is where our story truly begins, with the war everyone knows about, but does not really understand. Most of you remember learning about the War of 1812 in school. The details are hazy now perhaps, but the outline remains. American flags, naval battles on the Great Lakes, something about the British burning Washington, the impressment of American sailors forced into service aboard British warships, Native American tribes supported by Britain, resisting American expansion westward. You learned about James Madison declaring war. You learned about Andrew Jackson becoming a hero at New Orleans. You passed the test. You moved on to the next chapter. and you believed at that moment that you understood 1812. This is precisely what you were meant to believe. This narrative is not false, it is simply incomplete to the point of deception. Yes, the United States and Britain did fight from 1812 to 1815. Yes, the British did support Native American resistance against American expansion. Yes, impressment of sailors was a genuine grievance that contributed to the conflict. The conventional story is accurate in every specific detail. It is a masterpiece of selective truth. It tells you what happened in North America while maintaining careful silence about everything else. Consider what this focus means. When you learn about the War of 1812, you learn about military strategy, about generals and naval tactics, about territorial ambitions and diplomatic disputes. You learn why America fought Britain. You do not learn what Britain was actually doing, because Britain was not primarily focused on North America. Britain was fighting for survival against a continental power that had conquered most of Europe. You do not learn about Spain, where a brutal insurgent war was draining French resources and demonstrating that military force alone cannot impose an entire ideological system. You do not learn about the political chaos consuming European capitals as old orders crumbled and new possibilities seemed to emerge from the wreckage. Most significantly, you do not learn that while American ships engaged British vessels, while soldiers marched and bled and died for a conflict that would end in stalemate, something far more consequential was unfolding thousands of miles away. The official narrative creates a tunnel vision so narrow, so focused on one region and one conflict, that the larger world simply disappears from view. And this tunnel vision is not accidental. It is the direct result of how history has been chosen, edited, and taught. Your textbook presented you with one story and called it complete. But it was not complete. It was a fragment, carefully extracted from a much larger narrative. It was like describing a human body, by focusing exclusively on the fingernails, while ignoring the skeleton, the organs, the blood that gives the entire system life. But while America fought Britain, something far more destabilizing was unfolding thousands of miles away. In Europe, Napoleon was about to make a catastrophic decision that would reshape empires and trigger consequences still echoing today. And this is where our true story begins. Imagine standing in the year 1812 and looking across the European continent. The map before you would be shocking. One man, a Corsican general risen to imperial power, controlled more territory than any ruler since Alexander the Great walked the earth. Napoleon Bonaparte had redrawn the entire map of Europe. He had conquered France, of course, but also Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, significant portions of Germany, and Russia. He had made himself emperor. He had declared himself the heir to Charlemagne. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched under his command. His generals were the most feared military minds on the continent. To those watching in 1812, his dominance seemed permanent. His power seemed unshakable. How could such a force ever be defeated? Yet beneath this surface, certainty lay a creeping anxiety. Napoleon's continental system, his economic blockade designed to isolate Britain and force the island nation into submission, was beginning to fracture. Russia, once allied with France, was growing increasingly dissatisfied with the arrangement. The Tsar was tired of being subordinate to Paris. The Russian economy was suffering from the blockade. And Russia, remembering its own imperial ambitions, was beginning to imagine what might happen if French power somehow collapsed. In Spain, something even more troubling was unfolding. A guerrilla war raged in the peninsula, a conflict that seemed to defy the logic of traditional military power. Spanish populations, occupied by French forces, were fighting not for their king or their aristocrats, but for Spain itself. Thousands of French soldiers were dying, not in grand battles, but in small skirmishes, ambushes, raids. The Spanish resistance demonstrated something terrifying to Napoleon. His military machine, however powerful, could not impose itself through force alone when facing populations determined to resist. This was the context of 1812. This was the moment when Napoleon, concluding that Russia was becoming a threat, decided to invade. He would eliminate the Russian threat once and for all, he calculated. He would defeat Tsar Alexander's armies, and perhaps even Moscow. His military genius would ensure victory. So in the spring of 1812, he gathered his Grande Armée, over 600,000 soldiers, the largest military force assembled to that point in human history. He pointed them eastward toward Russia. He began what would become one of history's greatest catastrophes. But understanding 1812 requires understanding more than military movements. It requires understanding the ideological collision occurring at this moment. The French Revolution, for all its violence and contradictions, had introduced radical ideas into Europe: nationalism, democracy, the notion that merit should matter more than heredity, the belief that citizens should have some voice in governance. These ideas were revolutionary, literally dangerous, to the old orders of European monarchies. Napoleon, whatever his ambitions as an individual, had spread these revolutionary principles across Europe through military conquest. He had abolished feudalism in territories he controlled. He had introduced legal codes based on rational principles rather than ancient traditions. He had created systems of governance that, while still hierarchical and authoritarian, were fundamentally different from the old medieval systems they replaced. For some Europeans, this was liberation. For others, it was oppression imposed by a foreign conqueror. Populations across Europe faced an unprecedented identity crisis. Were they subjects of a centuries-old monarchy, or were they citizens of nations defined by shared language and culture? Should they accept the revolutionary principles Napoleon was imposing, or should they resist and restore the old monarchical orders? This ideological confusion, mixing with military conflict and economic crisis, created an atmosphere of unprecedented uncertainty. The foundations of European civilization seemed to be shifting. Old certainties were evaporating. No one could predict what would come next. This was the global context that made 1812 truly revolutionary. It was not simply about whether Napoleon would defeat Russia or whether America would defeat Britain. It was about fundamental questions of power, identity, and the future organization of human civilization. The choices made in 1812, the catastrophes that unfolded, the ideological ferment that emerged from the chaos, all of this would determine the trajectory of the next 2 centuries. Now we understand the stakes. But there is one element missing from every history book you have ever read. While the world's attention was fixed on Napoleon and military campaigns, something was happening in plain sight, something so consequential that it reshaped agriculture, economics, and population patterns for centuries. And it was completely preventable. The Grande Armée crossed the Russian border in June 1812, and the catastrophe began immediately, though few understood it at first. The campaign started with the assumption that had guided all of Napoleon's previous victories. Speed and surprise would demoralize the enemy, quick battles would destroy their armies, and superior French organization would ensure victory. But Russia was not Europe. Russia was vast in ways that stretched comprehension. The distances were immense. The supply lines that had worked in France and Germany and Spain suddenly became impossibly thin, stretched across thousands of kilometers of territory. The initial French advance was astonishing in its speed. The Grande Armée marched deeper into Russian territory, and the Russians retreated before them. For weeks, the Russians avoided pitched battles, drawing the French further and further into their homeland, stretching supply lines to the breaking point. Soldiers began to starve, not because food was unavailable, but because it could not reach them across the vast distances. The mud was worse than anything the French had experienced, what the Russians called Rasputitsa, the season of mud that rendered roads impassable. Horses died by the thousands, bogged down in mud up to their bellies. The soldiers, exhausted and increasingly malnourished, began to suffer from diseases that no battlefield could cure. Dysentery spread through the ranks. Typhus followed the lice that infested every soldier's body. In September, at Borodino, the Russian army finally stood to fight. The battle that resulted was unlike anything Europe had witnessed before. Historians described it at the time as the most brutal, the most devastating engagement in human history. For hours, soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in massive formations, firing muskets, dying in incomprehensible numbers. The artillery bombardment was continuous. Men fell by the thousands. At the end of the day, with over 100,000 casualties combined between the two armies, neither side had clearly won. But Napoleon could claim victory of sorts. The Russians had retreated and left Moscow open. The French entered Moscow only to discover that the city was burning. As the Russians withdrew, they had set the city aflame, destroying what supplies and shelter might have aided the French. Moscow was a hollow victory. There were no supplies to seize. There was no government to negotiate with. The Tsar was not negotiating. He was waiting. And autumn was approaching. Napoleon, faced with an impossible situation, made the decision that would doom his empire. He would retreat from Moscow, but he would wait until October, hoping for negotiations that would never come. When he finally gave the order to retreat, winter was already beginning. The retreat from Moscow is one of history's most devastating military catastrophes. As the Grande Armée began its march westward, temperatures began to plummet. By December, it was regularly reaching 30 degrees below 0 Celsius. Soldiers, dressed in summer uniforms designed for rapid European campaigns, had no protection against such cold. They froze to death in their sleep. Horses froze to death standing up. The army that had entered Russia with 600,000 soldiers began to disintegrate. Men died not from combat but from cold, from starvation, from disease. Some soldiers, driven mad by desperation, began to consume the flesh of their fallen comrades. Entire regiments simply vanished into the darkness and the snow, never to be accounted for. The retreat became a nightmare landscape. Soldiers marched in columns that stretched for kilometers, moving west, always west, toward the borders of Russia. Behind them came Russian cavalry, harassing the column, capturing stragglers. The wounded, who could not keep pace, were simply abandoned. Thousands froze to death in the snow. Thousands more died of typhus, their bodies stacked like cordwood in the frozen earth. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée crossed back into France, fewer than 100,000 soldiers remained alive. Over 500,000 had died. It was not a military defeat. It was an apocalypse. It was a catastrophe that destroyed the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and triggered consequences that would ripple across Europe for the next century. The Russian campaign was a catastrophe, but it was only the beginning of 1812's transformative power. Because what happened in Russia triggered a chain reaction that spread across Europe like a wildfire. Soldiers returned home broken. Empires that seemed eternal suddenly appeared vulnerable. And for the first time, European populations began to see themselves not as subjects of emperors, but as citizens capable of determining their own fate. The Russian winter of 1812 killed over 500,000 soldiers. But that was only the beginning of the human catastrophe that unfolded. As news of the disaster spread across Europe, as surviving soldiers began struggling home in ragged groups, something unprecedented began to happen. The entire social structure of Central and Eastern Europe began to convulse. Borders that had been drawn by Napoleon suddenly lost meaning. Territories that had been annexed into the Napoleonic Empire were no longer held by force. Governments that had been installed by French military might suddenly found themselves abandoned as French troops retreated. And populations that had been living under foreign domination, Polish populations incorporated into French satellite kingdoms, German territories reorganized according to Napoleon's plans, Italian regions ruled by French appointees suddenly found themselves in a world without clear authority. For millions of people, the collapse meant opportunity. Soldiers who had deserted the Grande Armée, rather than freeze to death in the Russian snow, could finally go home. Populations that had resisted French occupation for years suddenly saw the possibility of liberation. But liberation created chaos. Soldiers returning from Russia brought typhus and other epidemic diseases with them. Displaced populations, fleeing territories where political authority had collapsed, became refugees searching for safety and food. Families were separated as some fled east and others fled west, hoping to escape the chaos. Villages that had been integrated into Napoleonic administrative structures suddenly found themselves without governance or food supply networks. The humanitarian crisis that resulted has been almost entirely erased from historical memory. But for the people living through it, it was devastating. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced from their homes. Populations that had lived for generations in particular territories suddenly found themselves refugees in foreign lands. Some were forcibly expelled by new authorities, seeking to purify their territories. Others fled voluntarily, seeking to escape violence and disease. The result was a demographic reshuffling across Eastern and Central Europe. Ethnic and religious compositions of entire regions were transformed. Family connections that stretched across generations were severed. Cultural communities that had existed for centuries were scattered. The long-term consequences of this displacement would echo for generations. In places like the Balkans, populations that had been mixed together under Napoleonic rule suddenly found themselves separated, creating new ethnic identities and intergroup tensions that would eventually contribute to conflicts in the 20th century. Families separated in 1812 might not reunite for decades, or never. Children grew up in foreign territories, learning new languages, developing new identities. The experience of displacement shaped entire populations' consciousness, creating visceral memories of instability and loss that would influence how they understood security, belonging, and nation for generations. The war was over, but for millions of Europeans, it was just beginning. They had lost their homes, their families, their countries. History remembers the generals and battles. It completely forgot about the people trying to survive the aftermath. But those people changed everything about how Europe would develop for the next 100 years. But this humanitarian crisis was only one consequence of 1812. While Europe struggled with displacement and chaos, another crisis was unfolding, one that would prove even more consequential. A disaster so severe that it would literally change the shape of human bodies and the very biology of populations. This is where things get strange. As Europe was struggling with war, displacement, and the collapse of political order, something else was happening. Something that would ultimately prove more consequential than any military campaign. The agricultural systems that had sustained European populations for centuries were failing catastrophically. The causes were multiple and interconnected, creating a perfect storm of disaster. The Napoleonic Wars had devastated agricultural lands across Europe. For over 2 decades, armies had marched across territories, destroying crops and seizing livestock to feed themselves. Supply systems had been disrupted. Traditional trade networks that had brought grain from one region to another had been severed. In many territories, young men who would have been farming were instead dying in wars far from home. But the military destruction of agriculture was only part of the crisis. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted in one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The eruption sent ash so high into the atmosphere that it blocked sunlight across much of the globe. Temperatures plummeted. Growing seasons failed. Crops that should have grown did not. The eruption occurred after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but its consequences were devastating and global. The year following the eruption, 1816, became known as the Year Without Summer. Snow fell in June. Frosts killed crops through the entire growing season. Across Europe and North America, harvests failed. The combination of war-devastated agriculture and climate catastrophe created systematic famine. But this was not the kind of famine that made people starve to death visibly in the streets, at least not immediately. It was malnutrition widespread, systematic, affecting entire populations. People ate less than they needed. Children were born to malnourished mothers. Bodies that should have grown to their full potential were stunted by nutritional deprivation. Immune systems weakened. Populations became vulnerable to disease in unprecedented ways. Demographers, studying population records from this period, discovered something extraordinary. Children born between 1813 and 1816 were visibly, measurably shorter than their parents and than their own children. Malnutrition during critical developmental periods had permanently affected the physical stature of entire cohorts. Populations born during these years remained stunted for their entire lives, not due to genetic factors, but due to the simple fact that their bodies had not received adequate nutrition during crucial growth periods. The consequences extended far beyond physical stature. Populations weakened by famine were vulnerable to epidemic diseases. Cholera, which would sweep through Europe multiple times in the 19th century, would hit populations that had experienced this famine with particular ferocity. The weakened immune systems created during the famine years left populations susceptible to infections that healthier populations might have survived. Additionally, the economic devastation from agricultural failure forced populations into cities seeking work. Rural populations that had lived for generations on the land were driven to urban centers by sheer desperation. The agricultural famine of 1812 to 1816, accelerated urbanization and population migration in ways that would reshape European demography for the entire 19th century. What if I told you that 1812 did not just change empires? It changed human bodies, reshaped them, stunted them, made entire generations physically different from their parents. And this was not from warfare, it was from something far more fundamental, the inability to grow food. But the famine, the displacement, the collapse of empires, all of this was creating conditions for something entirely new to emerge. Ideas that would terrify the old powers, movements that would fundamentally challenge everything about how societies were organized, and these movements were being born in the chaos of 1812. After the Russian disaster, after Napoleon's retreat, after the collapse of French military dominance across Europe, something unexpected emerged from the wreckage. It was not a return to the old system. It was not nostalgia for the pre-revolutionary monarchies. It was something entirely new, and it would prove more powerful and more transformative than any empire or military force. It was called nationalism, and it would reshape the world forever. Nationalism did not arrive as a fully formed ideology with textbooks and manifestos. It emerged organically from the experience of foreign domination and from the ideological possibilities that the French Revolution had opened. In Spain, populations that had resisted French occupation for years developed a powerful sense that they were Spanish, that Spain was a nation defined by shared language, shared culture, shared suffering under foreign rule. This was revolutionary. Previously, Spanish identity had been fragmented. A peasant in Castile might have felt more connected to the Catholic Church than to someone from Catalonia. Regional and local identities dominated. But the experience of fighting against French occupation as Spanish people, resisting in the name of Spain rather than in the name of provincial allegiances or dynastic rulers, created something new. The same process was unfolding across Europe. In Germany, where Napoleon had reorganized numerous principalities and kingdoms into a simplified structure, Germans began imagining themselves as a nation. German language, German culture, German destiny. These concepts, which would have meant little to people a generation earlier, suddenly became powerful organizing principles. Johann Herder, a philosopher whose ideas about national character had circulated through European intellectual circles, suddenly seemed prophetic. His arguments that each nation had its own unique character, its own way of being, its own destiny, provided intellectual scaffolding for nationalist movements. In Russia, the victory against Napoleon created a powerful Russian nationalism. The Tsar, who had been subordinate to Napoleon's will, suddenly emerged as the defender of Russian independence. Russian soldiers who had sacrificed on the frozen steppes could now imagine their suffering as serving Russia itself, rather than serving a Tsar's ambitions. This nationalist consciousness united populations across class lines. Workers and aristocrats, peasants and merchants, all could imagine themselves as part of a Russian nation. This was extraordinary. It transcended the traditional divisions that had organized societies for centuries. What made nationalism so powerful was that it seemed to resolve contradictions that had plagued European societies for decades. The French Revolution had raised the possibility of popular sovereignty, the idea that ordinary people, not just aristocrats, could determine how their societies were organized. But how could you have popular sovereignty without descending into chaos? Nationalism offered an answer. The people would organize themselves as nations. Each nation would determine its own fate, but they would do so as unified bodies, not as disconnected individuals. This seemed to reconcile democracy with order, individual agency with collective purpose, revolutionary possibility with social stability. Yet beneath this apparent resolution lay tensions that would eventually prove catastrophic. Romantic nationalism emphasized the uniqueness, the superiority, the special character of particular nations. If my nation is special, better, more culturally advanced, more morally pure than other nations, then might I not have the right, even the duty, to expand at the expense of inferior peoples? These seeds, planted in the nationalist movements of 1812's aftermath, would eventually grow into 20th century fascism and ethnic nationalism. But this consequence was not yet visible. In the immediate aftermath of 1812, nationalism seemed to be a liberatory force. Populations across Europe embraced nationalist ideologies, and used them to resist the old empires and the old orders of hierarchical authority. Nationalism challenged emperors and kings. It suggested that ordinary people, organized as nations, could determine their own futures. It was revolutionary, it was powerful, and it would define European politics for the next century. After Napoleon fell, Europe did not return to the old order. Instead, something new was born. It was called nationalism, and it was more powerful than any king, any emperor, any traditional form of power that had ever existed. This idea that people belonged to nations based on shared culture and language would reshape the world forever. But nationalism was not the only powerful idea being born in 1812's aftermath. While some populations were discovering national identity, others were discovering something even more radical: the possibility of overthrowing entire systems of power and replacing them with something completely new. But even as revolutionary ideologies were emerging, as populations began imagining radical transformations, the old powers were mobilizing. Monarchs, aristocrats, the emerging middle-class elites who were profiting from industrial development, they all understood that the world was threatening to slip from their control, and they were determined to prevent it. What followed was one of the most sustained campaigns of repression in European history. The Congress of Vienna, held in 1814 and 1815, and often presented in history textbooks as a diplomatic success that restored order and stability, was actually something far more sinister. It was a gathering of the ruling classes of Europe for the explicit purpose of suppressing revolutionary movements and restoring hierarchical authority. The Congress established what became known as the Concert of Europe, a system where the major powers agreed to collectively suppress democratic and nationalist revolutions whenever they emerged. If a revolution threatened to erupt in Spain, the Concert of Europe would respond. If revolution threatened in Italy, the Concert of Europe would intervene. The ruling classes of Europe had learned a fundamental lesson from the Napoleonic Wars. They had to unite against the threat of popular revolution. They had to prevent the idea that ordinary people could reorganize society from taking hold. And so began an era of repression, unlike anything that had come before. Radical newspapers were censored. Radical thinkers were imprisoned or forced into exile. Police forces, more organized and more powerful than anything that had existed before, were deployed to monitor suspected revolutionaries. Spies infiltrated radical organizations. Informants reported to authorities. Secret police forces created elaborate systems of surveillance designed to prevent people from organizing. It was, in essence, the creation of police states across Europe, all in the name of preventing disorder, preventing revolution, preventing the dangerous idea that ordinary people might determine their own destinies. Ironically, this repression often had the opposite effect from what was intended. Suppression created martyrs. Radical ideas that might have seemed like academic abstractions became mystified, idealized, imbued with romantic power through their status as forbidden knowledge. The more authorities suppressed radical newspapers and imprisoned radical organizers, the more radical ideas seemed powerful, dangerous, attractive to populations desperate for change. And so the cycle continued. Repression begat more radical resistance. Resistance begat more repression. The result was a 19th century characterized by periodic revolutionary upheavals. The revolutions of 1830, the revolutions of 1848, labor uprisings, nationalist movements, communal insurrections. The old order, attempting to preserve itself through repression, was actually generating the conditions for its own eventual transformation. After 1812, rulers across Europe panicked. They realized the old system was broken, so they made a decision. They would band together and crush any attempt at change. They created a police state across Europe, but they were fighting an enemy they could not fully see or control: the idea that ordinary people could determine their own fate. So now we understand the ideological battle being fought in 1812's aftermath. Revolutionary forces trying to transform society. Counter-revolutionary forces trying to suppress them. But there was a third force that nobody was paying attention to, something that would prove more transformative than any ideology or revolutionary movement. Something that would change not just politics, but the fundamental nature of human life and civilization. But even as revolutionary ideologies were emerging, As populations began imagining radical transformations, the old powers were mobilizing. Monarchs, aristocrats, the emerging middle-class elites who were profiting from industrial development, they all understood that the world was threatening to slip from their control, and they were determined to prevent it. What followed was one of the most sustained campaigns of repression in European history. The Congress of Vienna, held in 1814 and 1815, and often presented in history textbooks as a diplomatic success that restored order and stability, was actually something far more sinister. It was a gathering of the ruling classes of Europe for the explicit purpose of suppressing revolutionary movements and restoring hierarchical authority. The Congress established what became known as the Concert of Europe, a system where the major powers agreed to collectively suppress democratic and nationalist revolutions whenever they emerged. If a revolution threatened to erupt in Spain, the Concert of Europe would respond. If revolution threatened in Italy, the Concert of Europe would intervene. The ruling classes of Europe had learned a fundamental lesson from the Napoleonic Wars. They had to unite against the threat of popular revolution. They had to prevent the idea that ordinary people could reorganize society from taking hold. And so began an era of repression, unlike anything that had come before. Radical newspapers were censored. Radical thinkers were imprisoned or forced into exile. Police forces, more organized and more powerful than anything that had existed before, were deployed to monitor suspected revolutionaries. Spies infiltrated radical organizations. Informants reported to authorities. Secret police forces created elaborate systems of surveillance designed to prevent people from organizing. It was, in essence, the creation of police states across Europe, all in the name of preventing disorder, preventing revolution, preventing the dangerous idea that ordinary people might determine their own destinies. Ironically, this repression often had the opposite effect from what was intended. Suppression created martyrs. Radical ideas that might have seemed like academic abstractions became mystified, idealized, imbued with romantic power through their status as forbidden knowledge. The more authorities suppressed radical newspapers and imprisoned radical organizers, the more radical ideas seemed powerful, dangerous, attractive to populations desperate for change. And so the cycle continued. Repression begat more radical resistance. Resistance begat more repression. The result was a 19th century characterized by periodic revolutionary upheavals. The revolutions of 1830, the revolutions of 1848, labor uprisings, nationalist movements, communal insurrections. The old order, attempting to preserve itself through repression, was actually generating the conditions for its own eventual transformation. After 1812, rulers across Europe panicked. They realized the old system was broken, so they made a decision. They would band together and crush any attempt at change. They created a police state across Europe, but they were fighting an enemy they could not fully see or control, the idea that ordinary people could determine their own fate. So now we understand the ideological battle being fought in 1812's aftermath. Revolutionary forces trying to transform society. Counter-revolutionary forces trying to suppress them. But there was a third force that nobody was paying attention to, something that would prove more transformative than any ideology or revolutionary movement. Something that would change not just politics, but the fundamental nature of human life and civilization. History textbooks treat the Industrial Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars as completely separate topics, as if they were unrelated processes happening simultaneously but independently. But this separation is artificial and obscures something profound. 1812 was absolutely crucial to how industrialization unfolded in the 19th century. Understanding the connection between these processes is essential to understanding the modern world. The Napoleonic Wars had already created conditions favorable to industrialization. Britain, isolated from European markets by Napoleon's continental system, had been forced to develop its own manufacturing base. The blockade meant that Britain could not import goods from Europe and could not export through normal channels. So British capitalists invested in manufacturing for the domestic market and for overseas colonies. War demands stimulated production of textiles, iron, and weapons. Factories were built, machinery was developed, steam power was harnessed. By 1812, Britain was already becoming the industrial centre of the world, but the collapse of Napoleonic order in 1812 created new dynamics that accelerated and transformed industrialization. With French military domination collapsing, territories across Europe were suddenly accessible to British goods. Technologies that had been suppressed or underdeveloped under Napoleonic control could suddenly spread. British industrial knowledge and British machinery began flowing to continental Europe far more rapidly than they could have under the previous imperial structure. The peace that followed 1812, despite the revolutionary instability, allowed for this diffusion of industrial methods across the continent. But something equally important was happening at the human level. The refugee crises, the population displacement, the agricultural disasters that followed 1812 created masses of people uprooted from traditional ways of life. Peasants who could no longer survive on the land migrated to cities seeking work. Populations displaced by war had no choice but to find new livelihoods. This created labor forces desperate enough to accept factory work under brutal conditions that would have been rejected a generation earlier. The human fuel for industrialization was being created by the disasters of 1812. What textile workers and miners were willing to endure in earlier periods would have sparked violent rebellion. But populations that had experienced war, famine, displacement, and social chaos were more malleable. They accepted lower wages. They tolerated longer hours. They submitted to the discipline of factory production because the alternative was starvation. Industrialization would have happened regardless, but the scale and speed at which it occurred in the decades after 1812 was directly enabled by the human catastrophes that 1812 had created. Moreover, the ideological transformations following 1812 created populations that were willing to imagine themselves as participants in progress. Nationalism created the belief that national development was progress, that industrial production meant national strength and greatness, that factories were the future. Populations could be mobilized around this ideology. The promise of progress, of national development, of material improvement. These ideologies made industrial discipline seem not like oppression, but like participation in a great national project. Additionally, the repressive political systems established after 1815 created social conditions where industrial production became a way to pacify populations. If you could not allow democratic revolution, if you could not allow populations to organize politically, you could allow them to consume. Industrial production meant increased wages relative to pre-industrial periods. It meant access to new consumer goods. Working-class populations became partially integrated into market economies as consumers. This created a kind of social stability, not authentic political participation, but the compromise of material consumption in exchange for political quiescence. While textbooks tell you that the Industrial Revolution just happened like magic because of better technology, they are hiding the real story. The Industrial Revolution accelerated, changed direction, and expanded across Europe because of what happened in 1812. War, famine, and revolution created the perfect conditions for capitalism to remake civilization. But industrialization was not just an economic phenomenon. It was a social apocalypse that transformed every aspect of human existence. And 1812 set the conditions for that transformation to accelerate dramatically in the following decades. Imagine being a peasant in 1810. Your entire life, and the lives of your ancestors for generations, has been lived in a rural community. You know every family in your village, everyone knows you. Your work follows seasonal rhythms. In spring you plant, in summer you tend, in autumn you harvest. In winter there are fewer demands on your labor, and you have time to rest, to repair tools, to socialize. Your identity is tied to your family, to your village, to the land you work. The future will be like the past. Your children will farm the same land. Your grandchildren will know the same rhythms. This continuity has existed for centuries. Now imagine 1815. The wars have ended. Your land, which has not been particularly productive even in good years, has been devastated. Soldiers marched across it. Crops were seized. The social order has collapsed. There is no work in the countryside. There is no future in agriculture. Your only option is to leave, to migrate to a city where you have heard there are factories that hire people. So you leave behind everything your family has known for generations. You travel to a city, probably a place you have never seen before. a place far larger and more chaotic than anything you have experienced. The city is overwhelming. There are thousands of people. No one knows you. You are surrounded by strangers. The smell is overwhelming: human waste, industrial smoke, animal manure, rotting food. The tenements where you find housing are cramped, disease-ridden, flooded with people. You work in a factory from dawn to dusk, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The work is repetitive, mechanical, demanding. You stand in one place, repeating the same motion thousands of times. The machinery is dangerous. Every day brings risk of dismemberment or worse. Around you are children, sometimes as young as 4 or 5, doing similar work. The food is inadequate. The wages are low. But they are more than zero, and zero is what you face if you do not work. So you endure. You live in a tenement with dozens of other families. You sleep in a room where the air is so foul that you can barely breathe. Diseases that you never encountered in the countryside, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, sweep through the neighborhoods. Children die at rates that would have been unimaginable in rural areas. People develop twisted spines and stunted growth from working in factories starting in childhood. The urban environment is a nightmare of filth and danger and overcrowding. Yet from a certain perspective, this is progress. You are employed. You are earning wages. You are participating in modern industrial production. The factory owners certainly see it as progress. They are becoming wealthy. The nation is becoming industrialized. The ideology of progress says that this is the inevitable direction of human civilization. What textbooks do not tell you is that this urban explosion was not inevitable. In earlier periods, populations would have resisted such conditions. But populations that had experienced 1,812 war, famine, displacement, the collapse of the world they knew were psychologically broken. They were desperate. They would accept conditions that earlier generations would have fought against. The factory system and urban explosion following 1,812 was enabled by the catastrophes that had preceded it. But the transformation was not just physical relocation from countryside to city. It was a fundamental restructuring of human experience. Time itself changed. Agricultural work has rhythms, daily rhythms, seasonal rhythms. But factory work is relentless, repetitive, synchronizing hundreds of workers to precise temporal schedules. The railroads that began spreading across Europe after 1815 imposed standardized time. Previously, different cities had different times based on the sun's position. Now, with railroads connecting them, standardized time was necessary. Suddenly, time became abstract, measurable, something that could be saved or wasted. Community changed. In rural villages, everyone knew everyone. In cities, you were surrounded by strangers. Traditional kinship networks, which had organized social life for centuries, fragmented. People lived among anonymous masses. Identity shifted from being embedded in family and community to being more individualized and fragmented. These transformations were not experienced as progress by those living through them. They were experienced as loss and displacement. Yet they were necessary to create populations that would tolerate factory work. Without this rupture in traditional social structures, without the desperation created by 1,812's disasters, the factory system could not have developed as it did. Imagine your entire world changing overnight. Your family farming for generations suddenly cannot survive. You are forced to move to a massive city where you are one of thousands. You work 14 hours a day in a dangerous factory. Your children grow up in tenements with no sunlight. This was not progress. But it was what happened to hundreds of millions of people. And it all accelerated because of 1,812. But the factory system and urban explosion created social pressures that no government could ignore. And these pressures would eventually lead to transformations in political systems, in how governments related to populations, and in how societies imagined their futures. The world that emerged after 1812 could not maintain the old forms of political authority. The economic systems that emerged in the decades following 1,812 were fundamentally different from anything that had come before. They were not simply capitalism. Capitalism had existed in various forms for centuries. They were specifically industrial capitalism, a system organized around the production of commodities through mechanized factory labor, the circulation of these commodities through global trade networks, and the constant reinvestment of profits into expanding production and technology. This was something new. The wars had disrupted traditional trade networks. Old economic centers had been destroyed. When peace came, reorganization was necessary. Populations displaced by war provided cheap labor. Agricultural failures had devastated rural economies, pushing workers toward industrial centers and creating demand for manufactured goods that could be transported and distributed through commercial networks. Revolutionary ideologies created pressure for economic transformation. Traditional feudal relationships and guild restrictions were abolished in territories that had been conquered and reorganized by Napoleon. When Napoleonic rule ended, those territories did not restore the old systems. New economic structures emerged instead. Modern banking systems developed to facilitate industrial production. Investors could pool capital into joint stock companies. Credit systems allowed rapid capital accumulation. Stock exchanges emerged, where shares of enterprises could be bought and sold. These were not entirely new forms of banking, and credit had existed before, but the scale and scope were unprecedented. Capital could be accumulated, invested, and reinvested at rates that had been impossible before. International trade reorganized around industrial production. Previous international trade had been primarily in luxury goods, spices, silk, precious metals, and in basic foodstuffs. Now, manufactured goods produced in British factories found markets across Europe and around the world. Raw materials flowed from colonies and peripheral regions into industrial centers in Britain and continental Europe. Capital circulated globally, seeking profitable investments. The world was beginning to organize itself into a global market, a system where production in one region was determined by demand in distant regions, where resources were extracted from some areas to feed production in others. The ideological justification for this system emerged in the writings of economists like Adam Smith and his followers. They argued that free markets where individuals and firms pursued their own self-interest, where competition determined prices and production, would produce optimal outcomes. They argued that this system would lead to material progress for all. That industrialization meant improvement in living standards. That growth was natural and inevitable and desirable. That this economic system was not merely one possibility among many, but was the natural outcome of human nature and rational organization. Yet beneath these optimistic narratives lay profound contradictions. The system generated massive inequality. Workers lived in poverty, while factory owners accumulated enormous wealth. The system devastated traditional economic actors, peasants, artisans, merchants who could not compete with industrial production. The system transformed ecosystems, depleting forests, polluting rivers, destroying the soil through unsustainable agriculture. The system created political instability by generating populations with nothing to lose. The working class that had been created by industrialization, which could potentially organize collectively and challenge the entire system. Most fundamentally, modern capitalism was not inevitable. It was a specific system that emerged from the ruins of the Napoleonic order and the crisis conditions following 1812. Different choices could have led to different economic systems, but the choices were made. The systems were created, and once created, they seemed natural and inevitable. This is crucial to understand. Capitalism presents itself as natural, as the only rational economic system, but it is actually a historically contingent system, created through specific human choices in specific historical moments. The economy you live in today was not always here. It emerged from chaos, from war, from desperation, and it was created by people who were trying to solve specific problems in 1812 and the years after. Once you see it that way, you realize it could be different. It is not natural or inevitable. It is a choice that was made. But as these economic systems expanded, they created new forms of power and new forms of conflict. Workers and capitalists had fundamentally opposed interests. Nations competed for markets and resources. The globe was being reorganized according to industrial capitalist logic. And this reorganization would produce unprecedented forms of violence and domination that would reshape global politics for centuries. Before 1812, European colonialism had existed for 3 centuries. Portugal and Spain had established colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Britain, France, and the Netherlands had built colonial empires. But pre-1812 colonialism was limited by certain practical constraints. Transportation was slow and expensive. The sailing ships that carried colonial goods took months to traverse oceans. Colonial populations were relatively small, limited by the difficulty of establishing European settlements in distant territories. Colonialism was primarily concerned with extracting luxury goods, spices from Indonesia, precious metals from the Americas, furs from North America, and with establishing trade monopolies. It was exploitative, certainly. It involved enslavement and genocide, but it was limited in scope. Most of the globe remained outside direct European control. After 1812, colonialism transformed fundamentally. Industrial capitalism created new imperatives for empire. Factories needed raw materials: cotton from India and America, rubber from the Congo, minerals from Africa and Latin America. Factories produced manufactured goods that needed markets. Industrialized nations needed places to invest surplus capital. Additionally, industrial technology transformed the practical capabilities of imperial powers. Steamships that could navigate interior waterways meant that Europeans could penetrate deep into African and Asian continents. Railroads meant that resources could be extracted efficiently from distant interior regions. Telegraph systems meant that distant colonies could be administered from European capitals. Rifles manufactured through industrial processes could mow down resistance fighters who lacked comparable weaponry. The result was a new form of colonialism. It was not satisfied with establishing trading posts and extracting luxury goods. It aimed at systematically remaking entire colonial territories according to capitalist logic. Indian textile production, which had been a competitor to British production, was deliberately destroyed. India's role was reorganized to be a supplier of raw cotton to British factories. African territories were carved up at the Berlin Conference in 1884, with European powers dividing the continent with rulers sitting at tables in Europe, with no concern for the territorial or ethnic boundaries that actually existed. These territories were systematically exploited for their resources. The Caribbean sugar islands, previously worked by enslaved Africans, were reorganized as plantation economies producing for export. Pacific territories were colonized to provide coaling stations for steamships, turning island communities into supply centers for imperial trade routes. The ideological justification for this new colonialism was more elaborate and systematic than earlier justifications. Social Darwinism, the belief that evolution through competition produced superior and inferior peoples, provided pseudo-scientific justification. Racial hierarchies, based on cranial measurements and other pseudo-scientific methods, claimed to prove that European peoples were biologically superior. The notion of a civilizing mission, the belief that colonization was bringing progress and civilization to backwards peoples, transformed brutal exploitation into an ostensibly humanitarian project. These ideologies permeated European culture and education. They became the common sense by which colonial violence was understood as beneficial. What emerged was a global system fundamentally different from what had preceded 1812. It was not simply extractive, it was transformative. Indigenous economies were destroyed and replaced with production for export. Indigenous political structures were replaced with colonial administrations. Indigenous cultures were attacked as backwards and replaced with European cultural forms. By the early 20th century, most of the globe was either under direct European control or within European spheres of influence. The colonial empires that had seemed temporary in the 16th and 17th centuries had become the defining feature of the global system. After 1812, European powers looked at the world and saw one thing: resources, land, labor, and they began reorganizing entire continents according to a single logic, making them serve European industrial capitalism. What they created was not just colonialism, it was a system of planetary domination so total that we still live inside it today. But colonialism was not just about extracting resources, it was about transforming peoples, about reshaping how they worked, how they thought, how they saw themselves. And the methods used to transform colonized populations would eventually be exported back to the colonizers themselves, creating new forms of social discipline and control inside Europe and North America. The demographic and biological consequences of 1812 created the conditions for something deeply troubling: the emergence of scientific racism as an ideology of power. We have already discussed how populations born during the famine of 1812 to 1816 were visibly stunted, shorter than their parents and their children. We have discussed how refugee crises created populations with visible cultural and linguistic differences. These physical and cultural differences, observed and measured by 19th century thinkers, created the raw material for an ideology that would have catastrophic consequences. European thinkers in the 19th century, observing visible differences between populations, began constructing elaborate theories to explain and justify these differences. Phrenology, the measurement of skulls to determine intelligence. Craniology, the pseudo-scientific measurement of brain size. Physiognomy, the interpretation of facial characteristics. All of these pseudosciences claim to prove, through objective measurement, that different populations were biologically different, that these differences were natural, immutable, and indicative of differences in intelligence, morality, and civilizational capacity. The crucial move was to take these observations of physical difference and interpret them as proof of inherent superiority and inferiority. European peoples, these theorists claimed, were naturally superior, biologically equipped for civilization and progress. Other peoples, African populations, Asian populations, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the Roma and Jews of Europe, were naturally inferior, suited for subordination and slavery. This was not prejudice or traditional bigotry. This was science. This was objective knowledge. This was truth, grounded in measurement and reason. These pseudo-scientific theories provided powerful justification for colonialism. Colonized peoples were not being exploited. They were being civilized. They were not being enslaved. They were being managed by those biologically equipped to manage them. The violence of colonialism was transformed into a humanitarian project, the bringing of progress to peoples incapable of creating it themselves. European rulers could look themselves in the mirror and believe that they were doing something good, that they were bringing development and progress to backward peoples, that they were engaged in a civilizing mission. But here is where it gets darkest. These theories did not remain limited to colonized peoples. They were exported back to Europe and applied to European populations. If colonized peoples were biologically inferior and needed to be managed, why not European workers? Why not the poor? Why not Roma or Jews, who were deemed less civilized than other Europeans? If biology determined civilization, then could not society be improved through biological management? This logic led to eugenics movements, systematic programs, to improve populations through selective breeding and population control. Immigration policies in North America were shaped by these theories. Populations from certain regions were deemed biologically inferior and were prevented from immigrating. Public health policies in Europe were shaped by these theories. Women deemed unfit were prevented from reproducing. Mental hospitals and institutions for the mentally ill became sites of experimentation and coerced sterilization. All of this emerged logically from the combination of industrial capitalism's need for systematic population management and the ideologies of racial hierarchy created to justify colonialism. By the 20th century, these ideas would culminate in the most horrific expressions, the eugenics programs of Nazi Germany, for example. They called it science. It was not. They called it proof of superiority. It was propaganda. But for over 100 years, these fake theories shaped how governments treated entire populations. They justified colonialism. They justified slavery's continuation. And they eventually justified things so horrible that the world had to invent words like genocide to describe them. These ideas about race and population were not just intellectual abstractions debated in universities. They became government policy. They shaped laws about who could immigrate, who could marry, who could have children. They transformed entire societies, and they emerged directly from the economic and social transformations set in motion by 1812. In the decades following 1812, the pace of European territorial conquest accelerated dramatically. By the 1882, European powers had divided up most of the globe. This was not simply the continuation of earlier colonialism. It was a new, more systematic form of territorial control, driven by the specific needs of industrial capitalism. This period became known as the Scramble for Africa, though it extended far beyond Africa. The technological advantages provided by industrialization made global domination possible in unprecedented ways. Steamships could navigate coastal waterways and interior rivers. Railroads could penetrate deep into territories, extracting resources and moving them to ports for export. Telegraph cables meant that distant territories could be administered from European capitals. Rifles and artillery manufactured through industrial processes gave European armies overwhelming military advantages over populations armed with traditional weapons. A few hundred European soldiers, equipped with industrial-era weapons and supported by modern logistics, could control territories containing millions of people. The motivations for this scramble were driven by the specific needs of industrial capitalism. Industrial nations needed raw materials for their factories. Britain needed cotton from India and America. Europe needed rubber from Africa and Southeast Asia for manufacturing. Iron, copper, tin, all the minerals necessary for industrial production became objects of intense competition. Industrial nations also needed markets for their manufactured goods. The domestic markets of Europe could only absorb so much production. Colonies provided guaranteed markets where European goods could be sold, and colonial populations could be forced to provide raw materials. Additionally, industrial capitalism produces cycles of boom and bust. Excess capital accumulates. There is more wealth than can be profitably invested in existing industries. Colonial territories provided opportunities for this excess capital to be invested. Infrastructure could be built. Plantations could be established. Mining operations could be developed. Investors could accumulate enormous profits. The competition between industrial nations for colonies created international tensions that would eventually lead to catastrophic conflict. Britain and France competed for dominance in Africa. Germany, a latecomer to industrialization and imperialism, was frustrated by the division of territories and the dominance of British and French powers. These tensions contributed directly to the diplomatic crises and arms races that would eventually produce World War I. But from the perspective of colonized populations, what mattered was not the geopolitical competition between European powers. What mattered was the systematic transformation of their worlds. Traditional economies were destroyed. Plantation systems and mining operations replaced indigenous production. Indigenous political structures were replaced with colonial administrations. Traditional cultures were attacked as backwards. Populations were forced to learn European languages and adopt European ways of being. The entire social structure of colonized territories was reorganized according to the logic of industrial capitalism. By the end of the 19th century, most of the globe was either under direct European control or within European spheres of influence. The world system that had emerged was fundamentally hierarchical. Industrial capitalist centers in Europe and North America at the top, resource-producing colonies and semi-colonies at the bottom, with most of humanity living in territories controlled or dominated by industrial capitalist powers. This global hierarchy, established in the decades after 1812, remains fundamentally intact today. The formal colonies have disappeared, independent nations have emerged, but the economic relationships remain hierarchical. Wealth flows from the global south to the global north. Resources are extracted from peripheral regions to feed production in industrial centers. The global hierarchy established in 1812's aftermath continues to structure the contemporary world. By the end of the 19th century, European powers had divided up almost the entire planet. Africa was carved into pieces at a conference table in Berlin. Asia was dominated by European trading companies and colonial governments. The Pacific was scattered with European military bases and plantations. And the system that made this possible? It was born in 1812. So now we understand the economic, ideological, and political systems that emerged from 1812's transformations. We understand how empires were reimagined and reorganized. But there is one more consequence of 1812 that textbooks almost completely ignore. Something that happened not in distant colonies or European capitals, but in the minds and bodies of ordinary people as they grappled with the transformations reshaping their worlds. Most of you have lived your entire lives in a world that feels natural to you. You wake up to an alarm clock. You measure time in precise units, hours, minutes, seconds. You work according to schedules determined by employers. You live in cities surrounded by strangers. Your identity feels individual and chosen, rather than inherited from your family and community. This world, which feels inevitable and natural to you, was actually created, and it was created in response to the transformations following 1812. Imagine the consciousness of a peasant living in 1800. Time is not measured in abstract units, but is tied to natural cycles. You wake when it is light. You sleep when it is dark. Your work follows seasonal rhythms. In spring, you plant. In summer, you tend. In autumn, you harvest. In winter, you rest. Time is cyclical rather than linear. Identity is not individual but is embedded in your family and community. You are not simply yourself. You are a member of the Muller family, a member of your village. Your role in society is inherited. Your father was a farmer, so you are a farmer. Your grandmother was a weaver, so your mother was a weaver. The future seems like it will resemble the past. Change happens slowly, if at all. Now, imagine the consciousness created by the industrial system that emerged after 1812. Time becomes abstract and measurable. Factories require precise temporal coordination. Hundreds of workers must arrive at exactly the same moment. They must work according to the clock, rather than according to natural rhythms or task completion. Railroads require standardized time across regions. Telegraph wires carry information instantaneously. Suddenly, time is no longer tied to natural cycles but has become an abstract resource that can be saved, wasted, allocated. People begin to experience themselves as existing within time rather than within natural cycles. The experience of labor changes. Agricultural work has rhythms. You can work harder or less hard depending on circumstances. You can take breaks. You can socialize with family and neighbors. Factory work is relentless and repetitive. You stand in one place, repeating the same motion thousands of times. You are synchronized with machines. You are treated as a unit of labor rather than as a person. Your labor is alienated from you. The products you help create are taken by the factory owner. Social experience changes. In rural communities, you know everyone. Your identity is embedded in these relationships. You are the son of the blacksmith. You are the brother of the three sisters. Everyone knows your family history. In cities, you are surrounded by thousands of strangers. No one knows you. No one cares about your family history. You are just another person in an anonymous crowd. This creates a kind of loneliness that rural populations had never experienced. It also creates a kind of freedom. You can be someone different in the city. Your identity is no longer completely determined by where you were born and who your parents were. Literacy and print culture spread rapidly after 1812. Newspapers proliferate. Books become more available. Ideas that would have circulated slowly, limited to oral transmission in small communities, now spread rapidly through print. Populations can now access ideas from distant places. This opens consciousness in radical ways. People begin to imagine themselves as part of larger communities, nations, movements, classes. They begin to imagine that the world could be different. Identity itself transforms. Instead of seeing yourself primarily as a member of your family, or your village, or your church, you begin to see yourself as a member of a nation. You are German or French or Polish. This national identity transcends local attachments. It unites you with millions of people you will never meet. This is revolutionary in its implications. After 1812, something strange happened to human consciousness. The way people experience time, community, work, and identity all changed. And they did not choose these changes. The changes were imposed on them by the transformations reshaping their worlds. But these changes would eventually produce entirely new ways of imagining human possibility. But changing consciousness created new possibilities. If people could experience identity differently, maybe they could imagine themselves differently. Maybe they could imagine societies organized differently. And that is exactly what happened in the political and cultural movements that emerged in 1812's aftermath. The industrial and social transformations following 1812 created unprecedented cultural ferment. New forms of artistic and cultural expression emerged as people attempted to make sense of worlds that were transforming around them. These were not isolated artistic developments. They were organic responses to the material transformations reshaping human life. Romanticism emerged as a powerful cultural movement in response to industrialization. Artists, poets, and musicians celebrated nature, emotion, authenticity, and individualism in reaction to the mechanical, rational, standardized world of factories and industrial cities. Romantic painters created landscapes celebrating natural beauty and human passion. Romantic poets wrote verse, exploring inner emotional worlds. Romantic composers created music, expressing individual genius and intense feeling. Romanticism was simultaneously conservative. It looked backward to pre-industrial worlds and progressive, because it articulated a powerful critique of industrial rationalism. The novel emerged as the dominant literary form in the 19th century, particularly in connection with urbanization and mass literacy. Novels allowed authors to explore individual consciousness in unprecedented depth. They could narrate the inner emotional worlds of characters. They could explore how individuals experienced alienation and displacement. Writers like Charles Dickens created novels that depicted the brutality of industrial cities and the suffering of urban populations. Dostoevsky explored psychological depths that earlier literature had barely approached. Visual art transformed. Painting was freed from purely representational demands. Artists began exploring color and form for their own sake, reflecting the fragmentation and alienation of modern life. Impressionism, developed in the 1,870 seconds, captured fleeting moments and sensory impressions rather than attempting realistic representation. Modern art, in all its various forms, expressed experiences that traditional artistic forms could not capture. Music modernized. Composers incorporated folk traditions, valorized by nationalism, while utilizing new technological possibilities created by industrial production, concert halls serving mass audiences, the piano as a mass-produced instrument, the mechanical reproduction of music through phonographs. Musical styles diversified and evolved in unprecedented ways. Sports transformed into mass spectacles. Athletic competitions that had been local or elite activities became organized mass events. Football, cricket, and other sports were professionalized. Stadiums were built to hold hundreds of thousands. These events provided communities in atomized industrial cities with collective experiences and shared identities. But not all cultural responses to industrialization were positive or progressive. Nihilism and existentialism emerged as philosophical responses to the loss of traditional meaning-making systems. If God was no longer believed, if traditional religion could not provide meaning, where could meaning be found? Nihilists concluded that existence had no inherent meaning. Existentialists argued that individuals had to create their own meaning. These were responses to the profound meaninglessness experienced by populations living through industrialization. Other movements sought to create new meaning-making systems. New religious movements emerged. Spiritualism attempted to make contact with the dead, providing meaning and connection in atomized industrial societies. Theosophy attempted to synthesize Eastern and Western spirituality into new, comprehensive worldviews. These movements were responses to the spiritual vacuum created by the decline of traditional religion. Mass culture industries emerged, producing standardized cultural products for mass consumption. Dime novels were produced in enormous quantities. Lithographic posters, mass-produced images for advertising. Later, cinema would create the most powerful mass cultural medium yet developed. These industries shaped what populations saw and imagined. In the chaos of industrialization, something beautiful emerged. New forms of art, music, literature, and culture that had never existed before. People were trying to express experiences that previous generations had never had to express, and in their art, they were often imagining better worlds than the ones they actually inhabited. But culture alone could not address the fundamental problems created by the transformations following 1812. Workers lived in poverty and danger. Colonized populations were being systematically exploited. Existing political systems seemed incapable of addressing these problems. So people began organizing politically, creating movements that tried to imagine and build fundamentally different worlds. The social dislocations and suffering created by industrialization did not produce only cultural responses. They produced political responses. Populations began organizing to demand change. What emerged were mass political movements of unprecedented scale and organization. Workers, facing brutal conditions in factories, began organizing into trade unions and labor movements. These were not elite conspiracies or secret societies. They were mass organizations, bringing together hundreds of thousands of workers around shared grievances. They demanded better wages, shorter working hours, safer working conditions. Later, they would demand political representation and eventually socialist or communist transformation of society. The labor movement created a sense of working-class identity, transcending individual workplaces or regions. Workers began to see themselves as part of a working class, with shared interests opposed to capitalist interests. Nationalist movements, born in 1812's aftermath, were transformed into mass political organizations. Nationalist ideologies, which had emerged from resistance to Napoleonic occupation, were now organized into political movements mobilizing entire populations around nationalist identity. These movements demanded independence for colonized peoples or national unification for fragmented regions. Nationalist movements became the dominant political force in the 19th century, challenging the legitimacy of empires and creating new nation-states. Women's movements emerged in the 19th century, building on new possibilities created by urbanization and mass literacy, while also responding to the specific ways industrialization affected women's lives. Women working in factories organized for workers' rights. Women seeking education organized for access to schools and universities. Women organized for political representation and voting rights. The women's movement was not unified. Different groups pursued different strategies and advocated different demands. But collectively, they challenged the patriarchal systems that had structured societies for centuries. Anti-colonial movements began organizing in colonized territories. Initially, these movements opposed specific colonial policies or sought to reform colonial governance. But over time, they radicalized. Populations in colonized territories began to imagine themselves as nations, to organize around nationalist ideologies, to demand independence and decolonization. Anti-colonial movements would eventually succeed in decolonizing most of the globe in the 20th century. These movements were not simply expressions of abstract ideas. They were responses to material conditions created by industrialization and imperial domination. Dense urban populations could be mobilized more easily than dispersed rural populations. Literacy allowed for mass communication through newspapers and pamphlets. Railroads allowed for coordination across large territories. Technologies of communication and transportation, created by industrialization, enabled mass political organizing that had been impossible in earlier periods. These movements terrified those in power. If millions of workers could organize collectively, if entire populations could be mobilized around alternative political ideologies, then the entire system of hierarchical authority would be threatened. The idea that ordinary people could determine their own fate, organize collectively, and transform society was revolutionary and dangerous to existing elites. And so ruling classes attempted to suppress these movements through repression, through creating police states, through controlling media and discourse. Yet this suppression often backfired. Revolutionary organizing continued despite repression. Movements persisted and often radicalized in response to being suppressed. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848 were not spontaneous eruptions, but the flowering of organizational effort and ideological ferment that had been building since 1812. After 1812, ordinary people began realizing something terrifying to those in power. They could organize. They could demand change. They could imagine alternatives. And across the globe, people began doing exactly that, building movements that challenged every assumption about how power should be organized. But these movements, despite their power and their mobilization of millions, faced a fundamental problem. How could you actually transform a global system organized around industrial capitalism, imperial domination, and hierarchical authority? The answer, tragically, led to some of the worst violence in human history. The First World War is often presented in history textbooks as a catastrophe that emerged from diplomatic failures and miscalculations. Specific events, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the tangled alliance systems, the mobilization of armies based on railway schedules, are presented as accidental causes of an unintended war. But this presentation obscures something fundamental. World War I was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of tensions and contradictions created by the system that emerged after 1812. Consider the international system that had developed in the 19th century. Multiple industrial powers competed for markets, resources, and strategic advantage. Britain dominated global trade and colonial territories. France was a major industrial power with its own colonial empire. Germany, unified in 1871, experienced rapid industrialization and wanted its own colonial territories and markets. Russia, Austria-Hungary, and other powers also competed within this system. This competition was not abstract or diplomatic. It involved real economic interests, real competition for profitable investments, real desires to dominate markets and extract resources from colonial territories. Nationalism, born in 1812's aftermath, intensified this competition. Each nation was not simply pursuing economic interests, it was pursuing what it saw as national interests and national greatness. Leaders could not simply negotiate compromises without appearing weak to their own populations. Nationalist ideologies made it politically difficult for leaders to back down in diplomatic confrontations. If the Tsar backed down in a confrontation with Austria-Hungary over the Balkans, he would be seen as weakening Russian power and greatness. If the German Kaiser backed down in a confrontation with France or Britain, his power and authority would be questioned. Nationalism created political dynamics that made compromise difficult. Additionally, the arms race produced by industrial capitalism created military machines of unprecedented destructive power. Nations invested enormous resources into building battleships, artillery, rifles, ammunition. Military theorists developed plans for rapid wars that they believed could be won through massive initial offensives. But when war actually came, the weapons proved far more destructive than anyone had anticipated. Trenches could withstand artillery bombardment. Machine guns could mow down attacking soldiers. What everyone expected to be a brief war turned into mechanized slaughter on an unprecedented scale. The imperial competition created additional tensions. Britain and France had already divided most of the globe, establishing colonial empires and spheres of influence. Germany, a latecomer to imperialism, was frustrated with this division. Germany wanted its own colonies and its own sphere of influence. These imperial competitions created crises, Morocco crises in 1905 and 1911, for example, where France and Germany nearly went to war over territorial disputes. These crises escalated tensions and created expectations of future conflict. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 demonstrated how regional conflicts could trigger great power rivalries. As Ottoman power declined, various Balkan nations fought over territorial control. Russia supported some Balkan nations. Austria-Hungary opposed their expansion. The competing interests of great powers turned regional conflicts into international crises. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, it triggered the entire machinery of competing interests. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and issued an ultimatum. Russia supported Serbia. Germany supported Austria-Hungary. France supported Russia. Britain supported France. Within weeks, the major industrial powers of Europe were at war. The war itself revealed the catastrophic potential of the system created after 1812. Millions of young men were mobilized into armies. They marched into trenches to fight in battles where they died by the hundreds of thousands for territorial gains of a few kilometers. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 killed over 1 million soldiers and achieved almost nothing strategically. Artillery bombardments killed indiscriminately. Chemical weapons introduced new forms of mechanized death. Naval blockades starved civilian populations. The war became total civilian economies were mobilized for military production. Civilian populations were targeted directly. Over 10 million people died in World War I. Entire generations of young men were destroyed. Economies were mobilized for war to a degree that seemed incomprehensible. Trench warfare demonstrated that industrial technology, when applied to warfare, produced suffering on apocalyptic scales. The survivors returned home traumatized, changed forever by experiences of mechanized death on unprecedented scales. The machinery for catastrophe was built in 1812 and the decades after. Competing industrial powers, nationalist fervor. Millions of workers turned into soldiers. And when the moment came, all of this machinery activated. And it produced a war so horrifying that over 10 million people died. Textbooks call it World War I. but it was actually the old 1812 system destroying itself. After 1945, the old system that had dominated the world since 1812 seemed exhausted. Fascism had been militarily defeated. The European colonial empires that had seemed eternal began to crumble. Independence movements in colonized territories succeeded in establishing new nations. India achieved independence from Britain. Indonesia achieved independence from the Netherlands. Across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, colonial territories became independent nations. Yet the systems established after 1812 did not disappear. They transformed. The Cold War represented a continuation of contradictions created by 1812. Two competing visions of how to organize industrial capitalism competed for global dominance. The Soviet Union represented a communist alternative to capitalist organization. The United States represented the dominant capitalist power. These two superpowers competed for influence across the globe, dividing the world into spheres of influence. The ideological conflict between capitalism and communism was, in essence, a conflict between two different ways of organizing the systems created after 1812. Decolonization represented both a liberation from the imperial system and a continuation of nationalism born in 1812. Colonized populations achieved independence and established their own nation-states. But the process of decolonization often reproduced the hierarchies created during colonialism. Newly independent nations often remained economically subordinate to their former colonial masters. Wealth continued to flow from the global south to the global north. Trade relationships between former colonies and former colonial powers reproduced patterns of extraction established during explicit colonialism. The formal empires had ended, but the global hierarchy remained intact. Environmental crises facing the contemporary world trace directly back to industrial capitalism and imperial systems established after 1812. Industrial production consumed resources at unsustainable rates. Forests were cleared. Fisheries were depleted. Minerals were extracted, with no concern for ecological consequences. The production of toxic waste polluted rivers, soil, and air. Greenhouse gas emissions from industrial production altered the climate. The logic of industrial capitalism, endless growth, endless consumption, endless accumulation, created ecological crises that threatened the viability of human civilization. Contemporary global inequality remains structured by the global hierarchy established in the 19th century. Industrial capitalist centers in the global north remain wealthy and powerful. Resource-producing peripheries in the global south remain subordinate. Most wealth continues to flow toward centers. This pattern, established during the era of explicit colonialism, persists through mechanisms of trade, debt, and foreign investment. The ideologies created after 1812 continue to structure how contemporary people imagine possibility and organize politically. Nationalism remains a powerful organizing principle. Racism, born as pseudo-scientific justification for imperialism, continues to structure hierarchies. The belief in progress through industrial development continues despite mounting evidence of ecological catastrophe. The belief that capitalism is natural and inevitable continues despite its demonstrated capacity to generate suffering and inequality. Contemporary political conflicts often pit different versions of nationalism, racism, and imperialism against each other. Very few political movements challenge the basic structure of industrial capitalism and global hierarchy itself. This is not accidental. The systems established after 1812 have become so naturalized, so embedded in how people understand the world, that alternatives are difficult to imagine. 1812 did not just shape the 19th century. Its consequences rippled forward through the entire 20th century and into our present moment. The world system established then still dominates today, and until we understand that system's origins and logic, we cannot imagine how to transform it. Understanding 1812's true consequences and how they extended across centuries is essential for understanding the world we inhabit and imagining different futures. The historical period following 1812 involved not just one dominant narrative but multiple competing visions of how the future could develop. If we look carefully at the historical record, if we pay attention to what was suppressed and forgotten, we can recover alternative possibilities that were prevented from materializing. These alternatives deserve our attention not because they were necessarily superior, some contained significant problems, but because their existence demonstrates that the world that actually emerged was not inevitable. Indigenous resistance movements attempted to preserve pre-industrial ways of life rather than accepting industrial transformation. In the Americas, Native American populations fought to maintain tribal sovereignty and traditional economies, even as American settlers pushed westward and industrial capitalism expanded. These movements were systematically crushed through military force and through policies designed to destroy tribal structures and force assimilation. But they represented a conscious rejection of industrial capitalism and an attempt to maintain alternative ways of organizing human life. Utopian socialist communities attempted to create alternative economic systems based on cooperation rather than competition. Figures like Robert Owen and Charles Fourier imagined communities organized around cooperative labor and shared ownership. Some of these communities were actually established communes where people lived together, worked together, and attempted to eliminate hierarchy and private property. Most failed, but they represented genuine attempts to imagine and create alternatives to capitalist production. Anarchist movements imagined societies without hierarchical state authority. Anarchists argued that ordinary people could organize themselves without governments, without state power, without top-down authority. Anarchist movements organized workers, peasants, and radical intellectuals around these ideas. Anarchist communism imagined a world where production would be organized communally, where distribution would be based on need rather than market mechanisms, where authority would be distributed horizontally rather than concentrated in state power. Various religious and spiritual movements offered alternative meaning-making systems to secular nationalism and industrial progress. Utopian religious movements imagined communities organized around shared spiritual principles. Mystical traditions offered alternative understandings of human purpose and possibility. These movements were diverse and sometimes contradictory, but collectively they represented resistance to the disenchantment and meaninglessness that industrialization produced. What is crucial to understand is that these alternatives were not simply defeated through competition with superior systems, they were actively suppressed. Military force was used against indigenous movements. Utopian communities were harassed and their members imprisoned. Anarchist organizers were arrested, imprisoned, and executed. Religious movements were attacked by state authorities. Governments and capitalists worked actively to prevent these alternatives from succeeding. Additionally, these alternatives were systematically forgotten. Textbooks did not teach about them. Schools did not celebrate them. Museums did not preserve their history. The dominant institutions of knowledge production, universities, publishers, newspapers, controlled which narratives were preserved and which were allowed to fade from collective memory. Through this process of active suppression and selective memory, alternatives were erased from historical consciousness. While textbooks were teaching one story about inevitable progress through industrialization and nationalism, millions of people were imagining completely different futures. And powerful people worked very hard to make sure those alternatives never succeeded, and even harder to make sure people forgot they had ever existed. But suppressing alternatives was not enough. Those who benefited from the system, established after 1812, also had to control the historical narrative itself, had to make sure that the system appeared natural, inevitable, and eternal. And they did this so effectively that most people today do not even realize they are living inside a specific historical system that was constructed for specific reasons. History is not simply a record of what happened. History is a narrative, a story about what happened, told from a particular perspective and shaped by particular interests. Understanding how historical narratives are created, preserved, and transmitted is crucial to understanding why certain stories are dominant while others are suppressed. Educational systems, controlled by governments and wealthy elites, determine what historical narratives are taught to students. Textbooks are written by authors selected by publishing companies. These textbooks must be approved by government officials and by local school boards. Publishers and officials, naturally, prefer narratives that support existing power structures and present current systems as natural and inevitable. Revolutionary narratives, alternative narratives, critiques of existing systems, these are often excluded from textbooks or presented in minimized form. Academic disciplines, established in the 19th century, partly to serve imperial projects, continue to structure what questions historians ask and which sources they consider credible. The discipline of history, as institutionalized in universities, privileges certain types of sources, official documents, writings of elites, while marginalizing others' oral histories, folk traditions, records of subordinated peoples. This creates systematic bias toward narratives of powerful people and against narratives of ordinary people. Archives and museums, which preserve historical records, were historically created by and for elites. Royal archives preserve records of governments. University archives preserve records of universities. The result is that records of ordinary people's lives and struggles are often absent or fragmentary. The archive itself embodies the perspective of those in power. Dominant media outlets, controlled by corporations and wealthy individuals, shape which historical narratives reach mass audiences. Popular history is shaped by what publishers decide to publish, what filmmakers decide to film, what television networks decide to broadcast. These decisions are influenced by what is commercially profitable and what is politically acceptable. Narratives that challenge existing power structures are less likely to reach large audiences than narratives that support them. This is not necessarily conscious conspiracy. It is more often the result of structural incentives and institutional logics that naturally favor dominant narratives. Publishers make more money publishing books that appeal to existing audiences. Television networks attract more advertisers by presenting familiar narratives. Universities receive more funding when they produce scholarship that supports existing institutions. The result is that dominant narratives are amplified, while challenging narratives are suppressed. This does not mean all historical scholarship is propaganda. There are scholars working actively to recover suppressed narratives, to challenge dominant interpretations, to reveal how power operates through narrative control. But these scholars often face institutional resistance. Their work is less likely to be published by major publishers. It is less likely to reach large audiences. It is less likely to be taught in schools. The result is that most people encounter history through narratives that have been filtered through multiple layers of institutional control. These narratives present existing systems as natural and inevitable. They minimize or ignore alternatives. They present dominant groups as heroes and subordinated groups as passive victims or obstacles. Understanding how this filtering occurs is essential to developing critical consciousness about historical narratives. History is not just about what happened. It is about who gets to decide what happened and which version of events gets repeated until everyone believes it is true. And controlling the historical narrative is incredibly powerful because it controls how people imagine the present and the future. Understanding how historical narratives are controlled is crucial because it allows us to understand something that has been hidden throughout this entire documentary. The ways that 1812 has been systematically misrepresented to serve the interests of those who benefited from the system it created. Standard historical narratives about 1812 systematically misrepresent what actually happened and what it meant. These narratives present 1812 as primarily about the War of 1812 and Napoleon's Russian campaign. Military narratives that focus on leaders' decisions and grand strategy. Military historians analyze why Napoleon made the decision to invade Russia. They discuss the tactics employed by generals. They describe the battles and the outcomes. This narrative is true as far as it goes, but it goes nowhere. What official histories omit is the humanitarian catastrophe, the ecological disaster, and the social transformations that made 1812 genuinely revolutionary. They omit the 500,000 soldiers who died in the Russian snow. They omit the millions of refugees displaced by war. They omit the agricultural famine that stunted entire generations. They omit the ideological ferment that transformed European consciousness. They omit the birth of modern nationalism and revolutionary movements. They present 1812 as primarily about military events while erasing the vast human consequences. Textbooks present the post-1812 period as one of progress and development, without examining the devastating consequences for colonized peoples, for workers in industrial societies, or for ecosystems transformed by industrial capitalism. They celebrate industrialization as progress without discussing the brutal conditions workers endured. They celebrate imperialism as bringing civilization without discussing the destruction of indigenous societies. They celebrate nationalism as liberation without discussing how it would eventually lead to ethnic cleansing and fascism. Standard histories present nationalism as a naturally emerging phenomenon, rather than as something deliberately constructed and ideologically promoted. They present it as organic expression of national character, rather than as ideology created in response to specific historical circumstances. This obscures how nationalism was deliberately promoted by intellectuals and political leaders, often for specific strategic purposes. Imperial histories present colonialism as bringing civilization and development to colonized peoples, rather than examining it as systematic exploitation and cultural destruction. They celebrate the achievements of individual colonizers, rather than focusing on the sufferings of colonized populations. They present colonization as beneficial, rather than examining how it disrupted traditional economies, destroyed indigenous political structures, and extracted resources. Most significantly, standard histories systematically erase the agency and resistance of colonized peoples, workers, and other subordinated groups. They treat these populations as passive objects of history, rather than as active agents attempting to shape their own futures. They do not tell the stories of indigenous resistance, of worker organizing, of slave rebellions, of women's struggles. By erasing this resistance, they make it seem as if the powerful simply impose systems on passive populations. Everything your textbook told you about 1812 was incomplete. It was not lying exactly just telling such a narrow, limited version of the truth that the full story was completely obscured. This documentary has attempted to tell a more complete truth. But even this is not the whole story. The whole truth might be impossible to fully capture, but we can do better than what your textbook offered. Now we need to confront the final question. If 1812 created the world we live in, and if that world is organized around contradictions and injustices, what does that mean for us? What possibilities exist for transformation? The systems, ideologies, and structures created in the aftermath of 1812 continue to shape the contemporary world. They are so embedded in how we live, how we think, how we organize ourselves, that we often fail to recognize them as contingent historical products. We experience them as natural, inevitable, simply the way things are. Global capitalism continues to extract resources from the global south to enrich the global north, using mechanisms that are more subtle than explicit colonialism, but that reproduce colonial hierarchies. Multinational corporations control vast territories and populations. Trade agreements are structured to favor wealthy nations. Debt mechanisms force poor nations to remain subordinate. The logic is the same as during explicit colonialism. Resources flow from periphery to center. Wealth accumulates in the hands of powerful nations and corporations. But the mechanisms are mediated through markets and seemingly neutral trade relationships, rather than through explicit military occupation. Nationalism continues to structure international relations and popular identity, even though nationalism's ideological bankruptcy was exposed by the horrors of totalitarianism and world wars. Nations continue to compete for power and resources. National interests continue to override international cooperation. Nationalist rhetoric continues to mobilize populations. New forms of ethnic nationalism continue to emerge, sometimes producing ethnic cleansing and genocidal violence. Racism, created as pseudo-scientific justification for imperialism, continues to structure social hierarchies within and between nations. Despite being discredited scientifically, racial hierarchies persist. Racial discrimination continues. Immigration policies in wealthy nations continue to be structured around racial categories. Environmental racism ensures that pollution and toxic waste are concentrated in neighborhoods inhabited by racial minorities. Racism persists not because it has scientific basis, but because it serves the interests of those in power. Industrialism's promise of infinite progress through technology continues to shape environmental policy, despite mounting evidence of ecological catastrophe. Governments continue to promote industrial development as the solution to poverty and underdevelopment. The extraction of resources at unsustainable rates continues. The production of toxic waste continues. Climate change accelerates due to greenhouse gas emissions from industrial production. Yet the response is typically to propose technological fixes, cleaner industries, renewable energy, carbon capture, rather than to question the fundamental logic of infinite growth. State institutions, created in their modern forms during the 19th century to manage industrial populations, continue to structure how most people experience governance and possibility. These institutions were designed to control populations, to extract taxes, to enforce property rights, to suppress revolutionary organizing. They continue to do these things. They have become so naturalized that alternatives are difficult to imagine. The working class, created by industrialization in the 19th century, continues to exist and to struggle against exploitation. The circumstances have changed dramatically. Massive deindustrialization in wealthy countries, continued or accelerating industrialization in previously non-industrial regions, the emergence of precarious gig economies and service sector employment. Yet, the fundamental dynamic remains. Those who own capital extract value from those who labor. Everything that 1812 set in motion is still happening. Global hierarchies, nationalist conflicts, environmental destruction, exploitation, it is all continuing. Not because it is natural or inevitable, but because the institutions and ideologies created then are still powerful and continue to shape how we live and what we can imagine. But understanding the past is not just about mourning what was lost or recognizing injustices that were committed. It is also about recognizing that different futures remain possible. And to imagine those futures, we need to look at movements and ideas that are already challenging 1812's legacies. Around the world right now, people are challenging the systems established after 1812. These challenges are not unified. They are diverse, often contradictory, sometimes in tension with each other. But collectively, they demonstrate that alternatives remain possible. Climate justice movements reject the industrial capitalist logic of infinite growth and attempt to imagine economies based on ecological sustainability. These movements argue that the climate crisis is not simply an environmental problem, but is deeply connected to systems of exploitation and domination. They demand that solutions to climate change prioritize the needs of those most impacted workers, losing industrial jobs, indigenous peoples defending their territories, poor communities facing environmental racism. They imagine economies based on renewable energy, regenerative agriculture, and reduced consumption. Movements for decolonization and reparations challenge the global hierarchies established during the era of European imperialism. These movements demand that wealthy nations that benefited from colonialism provide reparations to colonized peoples. They demand that colonial artifacts be returned to their countries of origin. They demand recognition of historical injustices and attempts to repair the damage. They imagine a world where the wealth extracted during colonialism is returned, and where formerly colonized peoples have genuine economic sovereignty. Feminist and LGBTQ+ movements challenge the systems of hierarchy and control over bodies created during the 19th century. Feminist movements organize for economic justice, for freedom from sexual violence, for reproductive autonomy. LGBTQ+ movements organize for freedom from discrimination and violence, for recognition of diverse identities and relationships. These movements challenge patriarchy and heteronormativity at both systemic and interpersonal levels. Worker movements in the Global South organize for dignity and fair conditions in a globalized economy. They demand higher wages, safer working conditions, the right to organize. They challenge the logic of corporate profit over human welfare. They imagine economic systems based on workers' needs and dignity rather than on maximizing corporate profits. Indigenous sovereignty movements challenge both capitalist development and state nationalism in the name of alternative ways of living. Indigenous peoples organize to defend their territories against resource extraction. They revive traditional practices and knowledge systems. They imagine ways of living in relationship with ecosystems rather than attempting to dominate them. They challenge the assumption that industrial capitalism represents progress and offer alternative visions grounded in centuries or millennia of indigenous knowledge. Technological and economic alternatives are being experimented with. Cooperative businesses, where workers collectively own and control enterprises, alternative currencies and mutual aid networks, local food systems and urban agriculture, renewable energy projects owned and operated by communities. These experiments are small in scale, but they demonstrate that alternatives to capitalist organization are possible. Movements for municipal democracy and participatory governance attempt to democratize decision-making. These movements organize at local levels where people can participate directly in decisions affecting their communities. They challenge both state hierarchy and capitalist markets by imagining governance based on direct participation and consensus. Around the world right now, people are building alternatives, building economic systems based on cooperation rather than competition, building movements that challenge global hierarchies, building ways of living that do not destroy the planet. These are not utopian fantasies. They are happening now, and they are direct challenges to the system born in 1812. Most contemporary problems, global inequality, climate crisis, resurgent nationalism and authoritarianism, psychological alienation, and meaninglessness, are not timeless human conditions. They are not the inevitable results of human nature. They are specific products of systems established after 1812. Understanding this is liberating. If these problems were created, they can be unmade. If these systems were constructed through specific historical choices, they can be reconstructed differently. Understanding 1812's history provides resources for resisting the naturalization of contemporary systems. If we know that global capitalism was constructed rather than inevitable, we can imagine it being reconstructed differently. We can ask, what would an economic system that prioritizes human flourishing and ecological sustainability look like? If we know that nationalism was deliberately promoted and constructed, we can challenge it. We can ask, what forms of political community could exist beyond nationalism? If we know that racism was created to serve specific purposes of exploitation, we can resist it. We can ask, what would societies look like organized on principles of genuine equality? Understanding this history also honors those who resisted, workers who organized despite brutal conditions and ruthless repression, colonized peoples who fought for sovereignty and liberation, thinkers who imagined alternatives even when alternatives seemed impossible, women and LGBTQ+ people who challenged systems of domination, indigenous peoples who preserved alternative ways of knowing and living. These people were not victors in a conventional sense. They did not successfully transform the world they lived in, but they struggled, they resisted, they imagined, and their struggles, even when they failed, demonstrated that alternatives were possible. This history demonstrates that change is possible. The world has been radically transformed before. In a matter of decades, after 1812, systems that had existed for centuries were dismantled and replaced with something fundamentally different. Capitalism was not inevitable. Nationalism was not natural. Industrialization was not necessary. These emerged as specific responses to specific crises. And if the world could be transformed once, it can be transformed again. But transformation requires understanding what we are trying to transform and why. It requires understanding the origins, logic, and vulnerabilities of existing systems. It requires understanding how power operates. It requires understanding that alternatives are possible. This is what historical understanding provides. The world does not have to look like this. The inequalities are not natural. The crisis is not inevitable. The meaninglessness is not unavoidable. These are products of specific historical choices made around 1812 and the decades after. And if they were created through specific historical processes, they can be unmade through different historical processes. That is not guaranteed, but it is possible, and understanding that possibility is the first step toward actualizing it. This documentary has asked you to see 1812 differently than your textbook presented it, not as a minor military conflict with limited consequences, but as a hinge point in human history where fundamental systems were created that continue to shape the world today. Not as the beginning of inevitable progress, but as the birth of systems that contain profound contradictions and injustices. Not as closed history, but as foundational to understanding our present and imagining our futures. The major arguments developed throughout this documentary are straightforward but profound. First, 1812 was not primarily about a war in North America. It was about the collapse of Napoleonic order and the restructuring of European capitalism. Second, this restructuring created ideological, political, economic, and ecological consequences of staggering scope. Third, these consequences included the birth of modern nationalism, industrial capitalism, imperialism, racism as systematic ideology, and the social movements challenging these systems. Fourth, Understanding these consequences is essential to understanding the contemporary world. This is not controversial history. It is based on well-established historical scholarship. Historians have long documented the famine following 1812. They have traced the ideological ferment that produced nationalism and revolutionary movements. They have demonstrated the connections between industrialization and the social disruptions following 1812. They have explored how imperialism transformed in the 19th century, but this scholarship has not been synthesized into a coherent narrative about 1812 as a foundational moment. Textbooks continue to present 1812 as primarily about the War of 1812. Popular understanding remains shaped by official narratives that obscure rather than illuminate. This documentary has attempted to tell a more complete story, but I must acknowledge the limitations of this attempt. Any historical narrative is necessarily selective. I have focused on certain consequences while necessarily omitting others. This documentary emphasizes economic and social transformation, while necessarily giving less attention to political and military history that textbooks emphasize. This documentary was created by people with particular perspectives and biases. Different historians and documentarians might tell this story differently. This documentary does not claim to have said the final word on 1812. It claims only to offer a more complete understanding than textbooks typically provide. The purpose of this documentary is not to replace one simple narrative with another equally simple narrative. The purpose is to open audiences to more complex, nuanced, multivalent understanding of how the contemporary world came to exist. It is to suggest that the world is not natural or inevitable, but has been shaped through specific historical processes. It is to suggest that understanding these processes might enable people to imagine and create different futures. This documentary has asked you to see 1812 differently than your textbook presented it. Not as a minor military conflict, but as a hinge point in human history. Not as the beginning of inevitable progress, but as the birth of systems that contain profound contradictions and injustices. Not as closed history, but as foundational to understanding our present and imagining our futures. But synthesizing what this documentary reveals is not enough. We need to think about what to do with this understanding. How does knowing this history change how you see the world? How might it change how you act? Imagine being a peasant in 1810. Your entire life, and the lives of your ancestors for generations, has been lived in a rural community. You know every family in your village. Everyone knows you. Your work follows seasonal rhythms. In spring, you plant. In summer, you tend. In autumn, you harvest. In winter, there are fewer demands on your labor, and you have time to rest, to repair tools, to socialize. Your identity is tied to your family, to your village, to the land you work. The future will be like the past. Your children will farm the same land. Your grandchildren will know the same rhythms. This continuity has existed for centuries. Now, imagine 1815. The wars have ended. Your land, which has not been particularly productive even in good years, has been devastated. Soldiers marched across it. Crops were seized. The social order has collapsed. There is no work in the countryside. There is no future in agriculture. Your only option is to leave. To migrate to a city where you have heard there are factories that hire people, so you leave behind everything your family has known for generations. You travel to a city, probably a place you have never seen before, a place far larger and more chaotic than anything you have experienced. The city is overwhelming. There are thousands of people. No one knows you. You are surrounded by strangers. The smell is overwhelming. Human waste, industrial smoke, animal manure, rotting food. The tenements where you find housing are cramped, disease-ridden, flooded with people. You work in a factory from dawn to dusk, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The work is repetitive, mechanical, demanding. You stand in one place, repeating the same motion thousands of times. The machinery is dangerous. Every day brings risk of dismemberment or worse. Around you are children, sometimes as young as 4 or 5, doing similar work. The food is inadequate. The wages are low. But they are more than zero, and zero is what you face if you do not work. So you endure. You live in a tenement with dozens of other families. You sleep in a room where the air is so foul that you can barely breathe. Diseases that you never encountered in the countryside, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, sweep through the neighborhoods. Children die at rates that would have been unimaginable in rural areas. People develop twisted spines and stunted growth from working in factories starting in childhood. The urban environment is a nightmare of filth and danger and overcrowding. Yet from a certain perspective, this is progress. You are employed. You are earning wages. You are participating in modern industrial production. The factory owners certainly see it as progress. They are becoming wealthy. The nation is becoming industrialized. The ideology of progress says that this is the inevitable direction of human civilization. What textbooks do not tell you is that this urban explosion was not inevitable. In earlier periods, populations would have resisted such conditions. But populations that had experienced 1812 war, famine, displacement, the collapse of the world they knew, were psychologically broken. They were desperate. They would accept conditions that earlier generations would have fought against. The factory system and urban explosion following 1812 was enabled by the catastrophes that had preceded it. But the transformation was not just physical relocation from countryside to city. It was a fundamental restructuring of human experience. Time itself changed. Agricultural work has rhythms, daily rhythms, seasonal rhythms, but factory work is relentless, repetitive, synchronizing hundreds of workers to precise temporal schedules. The railroads that began spreading across Europe after 1815 imposed standardized time. Previously, different cities had different times based on the sun's position. Now, with railroads connecting them, standardized time was necessary. Suddenly, time became abstract, measurable, something that could be saved or wasted. Community changed. In rural villages, everyone knew everyone. In cities, you were surrounded by strangers. Traditional kinship networks, which had organized social life for centuries, fragmented. People lived among anonymous masses. Identity shifted from being embedded in family and community to being more individualized and fragmented. These transformations were not experienced as progress by those living through them. They were experienced as loss and displacement, yet they were necessary to create populations that would tolerate factory work. Without this rupture in traditional social structures, without the desperation created by 1812's disasters, the factory system could not have developed as it did. Imagine your entire world changing overnight. Your family farming for generations suddenly cannot survive. You are forced to move to a massive city where you are one of thousands. You work 14 hours a day in a dangerous factory. Your children grow up in tenements with no sunlight. This was not progress, but it was what happened to hundreds of millions of people, and it all accelerated because of 1812. But the factory system and urban explosion created social pressures that no government could ignore, and these pressures would eventually lead to transformations in political systems, in how governments related to populations, and in how societies imagined their futures. The world that emerged after 1812 could not maintain the old forms of political authority. Imagine being a peasant in 1810. Your entire life, and the lives of your ancestors for generations, has been lived in a rural community. You know every family in your village. Everyone knows you. Your work follows seasonal rhythms. In spring you plant. In summer you tend. In autumn you harvest. In winter there are fewer demands on your labor, and you have time to rest, to repair tools, to socialize. Your identity is tied to your family, to your village, to the land you work. The future will be like the past. Your children will farm the same land. Your grandchildren will know the same rhythms. This continuity has existed for centuries. Now imagine 1815. The wars have ended. Your land, which has not been particularly productive even in good years, has been devastated. Soldiers marched across it. Crops were seized. The social order has collapsed. There is no work in the countryside. There is no future in agriculture. Your only option is to leave, to migrate to a city where you have heard there are factories that hire people. So you leave behind everything your family has known for generations. You travel to a city, probably a place you have never seen before, a place far larger and more chaotic than anything you have experienced. The city is overwhelming. There are thousands of people, No one knows you. You are surrounded by strangers. The smell is overwhelming. Human waste, industrial smoke, animal manure, rotting food. The tenements where you find housing are cramped, disease-ridden, flooded with people. You work in a factory from dawn to dusk, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The work is repetitive, mechanical, demanding. You stand in one place, repeating the same motion thousands of times. The machinery is dangerous. Every day brings risk of dismemberment or worse. Around you are children sometimes as young as 4 or 5 doing similar work. The food is inadequate. The wages are low. But they are more than zero. And zero is what you face if you do not work. So you endure. You live in a tenement with dozens of other families. You sleep in a room where the air is so foul that you can barely breathe. Diseases that you never encountered in the countryside, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, sweep through the neighborhoods. Children die at rates that would have been unimaginable in rural areas. People develop twisted spines and stunted growth from working in factories starting in childhood. The urban environment is a nightmare of filth and danger and overcrowding. Yet from a certain perspective, this is progress. You are employed. You are earning wages. You are participating in modern industrial production. The factory owners certainly see it as progress. They are becoming wealthy. The nation is becoming industrialized. The ideology of progress says that this is the inevitable direction of human civilization. What textbooks do not tell you is that this urban explosion was not inevitable. In earlier periods, populations would have resisted such conditions. But populations that had experienced 1,812 war, famine, displacement, the collapse of the world they knew were psychologically broken. They were desperate. They would accept conditions that earlier generations would have fought against. The factory system and urban explosion following 1,812 was enabled by the catastrophes that had preceded it. But the transformation was not just physical relocation from countryside to city. It was a fundamental restructuring of human experience. Time itself changed. Agricultural work has rhythms, daily rhythms, seasonal rhythms. But factory work is relentless, repetitive, synchronizing hundreds of workers to precise temporal schedules. The railroads that began spreading across Europe after 1815 imposed standardized time. Previously, different cities had different times based on the sun's position. Now, with railroads connecting them, standardized time was necessary. Suddenly, time became abstract, measurable, something that could be saved or wasted. Community changed. In rural villages, everyone knew everyone. In cities, you were surrounded by strangers. Traditional kinship networks, which had organized social life for centuries, fragmented. People lived among anonymous masses. Identity shifted from being embedded in family and community to being more individualized and fragmented. These transformations were not experienced as progress by those living through them. They were experienced as loss and displacement. Yet they were necessary to create populations that would tolerate factory work. Without this rupture in traditional social structures, without the desperation created by 1,812's disasters, the factory system could not have developed as it did. Imagine your entire world changing overnight. Your family farming for generations suddenly cannot survive. You are forced to move to a massive city where you are one of thousands. You work 14 hours a day in a dangerous factory. Your children grow up in tenements with no sunlight. This was not progress, but it was what happened to hundreds of millions of people. And it all accelerated because of 1,812. But the factory system and urban explosion created social pressures that no government could ignore. And these pressures would eventually lead to transformations in political systems, in how governments related to populations, and in how societies imagined their futures. The world that emerged after 1812 could not maintain the old forms of political authority. The economic systems that emerged in the decades following 1,812 were fundamentally different from anything that had come before. They were not simply capitalism. Capitalism had existed, in various forms, for centuries. They were specifically industrial capitalism, a system organized around the production of commodities through mechanized factory labor, the circulation of these commodities through global trade networks, and the constant reinvestment of profits into expanding production and technology. This was something new. The wars had disrupted traditional trade networks. Old economic centers had been destroyed. When peace came, reorganization was necessary. Populations displaced by war provided cheap labor. Agricultural failures had devastated rural economies, pushing workers toward industrial centers and creating demand for manufactured goods that could be transported and distributed through commercial networks. Revolutionary ideologies created pressure for economic transformation. Traditional feudal relationships and guild restrictions were abolished in territories that had been conquered and reorganized by Napoleon. When Napoleonic rule ended, those territories did not restore the old systems. New economic structures emerged instead. Modern banking systems developed to facilitate industrial production. Investors could pool capital into joint stock companies. Credit systems allowed rapid capital accumulation. Stock exchanges emerged where shares of enterprises could be bought and sold. These were not entirely new forms of banking, and credit had existed before. But the scale and scope were unprecedented. Capital could be accumulated, invested, and reinvested at rates that had been impossible before. International trade reorganized around industrial production. Previous international trade had been primarily in luxury goods, spices, silk, precious metals, and in basic foodstuffs. Now manufactured goods produced in British factories found markets across Europe and around the world. Raw materials flowed from colonies and peripheral regions into industrial centers in Britain and continental Europe. Capital circulated globally, seeking profitable investments. The world was beginning to organize itself into a global market, a system where production in one region was determined by demand in distant regions, where resources were extracted from some areas to feed production in others. The ideological justification for this system emerged in the writings of economists like Adam Smith and his followers. They argued that free markets where individuals and firms pursued their own self-interest, where competition determined prices and production, would produce optimal outcomes. They argued that this system would lead to material progress for all. That industrialization meant improvement in living standards. That growth was natural and inevitable and desirable. That this economic system was not merely one possibility among many, but was the natural outcome of human nature and rational organization. Yet beneath these optimistic narratives lay profound contradictions. The system generated massive inequality. Workers lived in poverty, while factory owners accumulated enormous wealth. The system devastated traditional economic actors, peasants, artisans, merchants who could not compete with industrial production. The system transformed ecosystems, depleting forests, polluting rivers, destroying the soil through unsustainable agriculture. The system created political instability by generating populations with nothing to lose. The working class that had been created by industrialization, which could potentially organize collectively and challenge the entire system. Most fundamentally, modern capitalism was not inevitable. It was a specific system that emerged from the ruins of the Napoleonic order and the crisis conditions following 1812. Different choices could have led to different economic systems, but the choices were made. The systems were created, and once created, they seemed natural and inevitable. This is crucial to understand. Capitalism presents itself as natural, as the only rational economic system, but it is actually a historically contingent system, created through specific human choices in specific historical moments. The economy you live in today was not always here. It emerged from chaos, from war, from desperation, and it was created by people who were trying to solve specific problems in 1812 and the years after. Once you see it that way, you realize it could be different. It is not natural or inevitable. It is a choice that was made. But as these economic systems expanded, they created new forms of power and new forms of conflict. Workers and capitalists had fundamentally opposed interests. Nations competed for markets and resources. The globe was being reorganized according to industrial capitalist logic, and this reorganization would produce unprecedented forms of violence and domination that would reshape global politics for centuries.